The starving girl. Mark walked carefully across the dusty, red surface of the unknown planet. His boots crunched against the dry ground, leaving small prints behind. The air was thin, the sky dark with swirling clouds. His oxygen scanner beeped softly, just enough air to breathe, but not for long. He adjusted his helmet and kept walking. His spaceship had landed in a rocky valley, far from any signs of life, or so he thought. Then he saw her. A small, thin figure lay curled under a jagged rock. Her skin was pale, almost silver in the dim light. Her hair, long and tangled, covered most of her face. She looked weak, barely moving. Mark stopped, his heart pounding. Was she dead? Carefully, he took a step closer. The girl's chest rose, slow, shallow breaths. She was alive, but just barely. Mark knelt beside her. "Hey, can you hear me?" he asked softly. No answer, only the sound of the wind whispering through the rocks. He reached into his pack, pulling out a small metal container. Inside was a ration bar, dried food, not tasty, but enough to survive. He unwrapped it and held it close to the girl's face. A sudden movement. Her eyes snapped open, bright, golden. She reached out and lightly pressed her fingers against his chest. Mark exhaled. "Okay, that's new." She stared at him, her fingers still on his chest. Then she pressed her palm flat against him. It was like she was feeling his heartbeat, testing something. He didn't stop her. Her eyes were wide with curiosity. Slowly, she moved her hand up to his neck, brushing against his pulse. Then her other hand lifted, gently touching his face. Her fingers were cold against his warm skin. Mark swallowed hard. Personal space. Ever heard of it? She tilted her head at his words, clearly not understanding. Instead, she leaned in closer, studying him like he was some strange creature. Then she spoke. A single word, soft, unfamiliar. Mark frowned. What was that? She repeated it, her voice barely above a whisper. The sound was delicate, melodic, nothing like any human language. Mark pointed to himself. "Mark." The girl blinked. He tapped his chest. "Mark," he said again, slower this time. Her golden eyes narrowed as she thought about it. Then she hesitantly copied him. "M. Mark." Mark's eyebrows shot up. "Holy shit," he muttered. "You're a fast learner." The girl's lips twitched slightly, almost like she was amused. Then she reached forward and tapped his chest again. "Mark." He nodded. "Yeah, that's me." She watched him for a second, then tapped her own chest. "Saya." Mark blinked. "Saya." She nodded, her expression serious. Mark let out a slow breath. "All right, Saya. Guess that's your name." She smiled, a small, satisfied smile, like she was proud of herself. Mark leaned back on his hands, staring up at the sky. His ship was about a half-day's walk from here. He had planned to return to it before nightfall. But now, things had changed. He glanced at Sia, who was now watching his every movement. She was studying him, memorizing him. Mark sighed. "You're not gonna let me leave, are you?" Saya tilted her head, then scooted even closer. "Yeah." That was a no. That night, the temperature dropped fast as the twin suns set behind the jagged mountains. Mark had built a small fire using some dry alien wood he had found nearby. The flames flickered, casting long shadows over the rocky terrain. Saya sat across from him, legs tucked beneath her. The firelight reflected in her golden eyes, making them glow even more. She hadn't stopped watching him since they met. Mark ran a hand through his short brown hair and exhaled. "You're making this really weird, you know." No response. He tore open another ration pack and held it out to her. She took it, but instead of eating immediately, she hesitated. Then she did something unexpected. She broke the food in half and held out a piece to him. Mark frowned. "You want me to eat?" Saya nodded. Mark hesitated, then took the food. He hadn't planned to eat yet, but something about this moment felt important, like a silent exchange. They ate together, in complete silence. For the first time, it didn't feel awkward. After finishing, Mark leaned back against a boulder, letting the warmth of the fire soak into his skin. He glanced at Sia, who was still sitting upright, watching him closely. He sighed. "You're gonna stay up all night staring at me, aren't you?" Sia didn't answer. She just crawled closer, sitting next to him this time. Then, without warning, she leaned her head against his shoulder. Mark froze. Her breathing slowed, her body relaxing. Within minutes, she was asleep. Mark let out a shaky breath. What the hell was happening? Just yesterday, he was alone, exploring an empty planet. Now, he had an alien girl sleeping on his shoulder like he was the only safe thing in her world. He didn't know why, but something deep inside told him she wasn't going to let him go. And for some reason, he wasn't sure he wanted to leave her behind. The protector. Mark's eyes snapped open. Something was wrong. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the jagged rocks. The air was colder now, sharp against his skin. But that wasn't what woke him. It was Sia. She was no longer curled against his side. Instead, she was crouched a few feet away, her body tense, her glowing golden eyes locked on the darkness beyond the firelight. Mark sat up slowly. "Sia." She didn't respond. Her breathing was slow but controlled. One of her hands was pressed against the ground, the other curled into a tight fist. She wasn't just watching something. She was ready to attack. Mark followed her gaze into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing, just the endless stretch of alien terrain, the cold wind whispering between the rocks. Then he heard it, a deep guttural growl. Mark stiffened. He reached for his sidearm, fingers tightening around the grip. His heart pounded as he scanned the darkness, trying to pinpoint the source. Sia shifted slightly, pressing a hand against his chest. A silent command. "Stay still." Mark obeyed. Another growl, this time closer. Then movement. From the shadows, something big stepped forward. Mark's stomach dropped. The creature stood at least 7 feet tall, its body covered in thick, matted fur. Its eyes were small but burning red, its mouth lined with rows of jagged teeth. It walked on all fours, but the way its back arched suggested it could stand upright if needed. And worst of all, there wasn't just one. 2 more emerged from the darkness, circling the fire. Mark's grip on his weapon tightened. He had fought alien creatures before, but these things weren't just predators. They were hunters, smart, patient. They hadn't attacked yet, which meant they were testing him, testing them both. Sia remained completely still, but Mark could see it now, her fingers twitching slightly, her breathing controlled, her muscles coiled like a spring. She was waiting for something. And then, in a single breath, she moved. She shot forward so fast, Mark barely registered it. One moment she was beside him, the next she was on the nearest creature, her thin fingers gripping its throat. The beast let out a strangled roar, but before it could react, Sia slammed its head against a rock, hard. A sickening crunch echoed through the night. The other 2 creatures snarled and lunged forward. Mark barely had time to raise his gun before Sia spun around, grabbing a handful of loose dirt and throwing it into the face of the closest beast. It howled, blinded, stumbling backward. Mark fired. The plasma shot hit the second creature in the chest, sending it reeling. But these things were tough. The blinded creature shook its head, recovering fast. The second one, though injured, was already regaining its footing. Mark cursed under his breath. He could take 1, maybe 2 if he was lucky. But these things were fast, strong. And Sia wasn't running. She was standing between him and the creatures, her stance low, her fingers curled like claws. Mark's heart pounded. She wasn't just some lost girl. She was a fighter. The beasts hesitated now, growling low. They had expected easy prey. They had not expected this. Saya let out a soft, clicking sound. A warning. The creatures exchanged glances. Then, as suddenly as they had come, they backed away, retreating into the darkness. Mark didn't lower his gun until the last of them disappeared. Only then did he let out a slow breath. Saya turned to him, golden eyes burning bright in the dim firelight. She had just saved his life. Again. Aftermath. Mark sat on a rock, running a hand through his hair. His heart was still hammering in his chest. Saya crouched in front of him, watching. "You can fight," Mark muttered. It was obvious now, but saying it out loud felt necessary. Saya didn't respond. Instead, she reached out and touched his chest, just like before. Only this time, her fingers moved, tracing over the fabric of his jacket, pressing lightly against his heartbeat. It took Mark a second to understand. She wasn't just checking if he was okay. She was memorizing him. Mark exhaled, forcing himself to relax. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" Saya tilted her head. Then, slowly, she reached out and grabbed his hand. Mark blinked. Her fingers curled around his, her grip surprisingly firm. She gave his hand a small squeeze. Mark swallowed. This wasn't just gratitude. This was something deeper. A silent promise. A bond. For some reason, that realization sent a chill down his spine. The truth about her. Mark sat by the fire, staring at the flickering flames, his mind racing. Saya was sitting beside him, still as a statue. Her golden eyes reflected the light, unblinking, intense. She hadn't let go of his hand. Her fingers remained wrapped around his, firm but gentle. Mark didn't know what to think anymore. Just hours ago, he had believed she was a weak, starving alien girl in need of help. Now he knew better. She was strong. She was fast. She had killed without hesitation. But she had also protected him. And now she wouldn't leave his side. He exhaled, rubbing his face. "All right," he muttered. "Time for some answers." Saya blinked. She tilted her head, watching him closely. Mark pointed to her, then mimicked her earlier movements, clawing at the air, moving with sharp, precise motions. "You can fight," he said. Saya's expression didn't change. She reached down, grabbing a small rock, and held it between her fingers. Then, with frightening speed, she flicked it forward. The rock shot through the air like a bullet, slamming into another rock a few meters away. A sharp crack echoed in the silence. Mark stared. Holy shit. She was dangerous, but she wasn't trying to intimidate him. She was showing him. A silent conversation. "Yes, I can fight. Yes, I am strong. Yes, I am different." Mark swallowed. "Okay. Then why didn't you attack me when I found you?" Saya's gaze softened. Slowly, she tapped her chest, then his. "You helped me." Mark frowned. "That's it. You trust me just because I gave you food." She hesitated, then shook her head. Not just trust, something more. Mark didn't like where this was going. He sighed, glancing up at the dark sky. "I need to know what you are, Sia. Where did you come from?" At first, she didn't react. Then, she let go of his hand and turned slightly. Using her fingers, she drew something in the dirt. A circle. Then, another circle inside it. Then, a small dot in the center. Mark frowned, studying the symbol. It looked almost like a planet. Saya pointed to the inner circle, then tapped the ground beneath them. Mark's breath caught. "This is your home." She nodded. Then, slowly, she wiped the entire drawing away with her hand. Mark's stomach sank. Gone. Erased. Destroyed. He exhaled sharply. "Your people." Saya lowered her head. Mark ran a hand through his hair. His mind raced through possibilities. Had there been a war? An invasion? A natural disaster? Something had wiped out her kind, and she had been left behind. Alone. Mark's chest tightened. He had seen loss before. He had fought in battles, watched entire colonies burn. But this was different. Because now, she had no one but him. Saya suddenly reached forward and touched his arm. When he looked at her, she was staring at him, her gaze intense, almost desperate. Then she moved her hand to his chest, fingers pressing over his heart. Mark frowned. "What are you?" Saya leaned forward, her forehead pressed lightly against his. Mark froze. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't aggressive. It was something else. Something ancient. Something deeply personal. A connection. Her voice was soft, a whisper. "Mark." His heart pounded. "Saya." She pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. Then she raised both hands and made a cradling motion, like she was holding a baby. Mark's breath hitched. "No," he said quickly, shaking his head. "No, no, no. That's not." Saya tilted her head, confused. Mark exhaled sharply. His mind was a storm of emotions. She wasn't just thanking him for saving her. She wasn't just trusting him. She had chosen him. And in her culture, whatever was left of it, that meant something serious. Mark stood up abruptly, rubbing his face. "Okay. I need air." Saya washed him, her expression unreadable. Mark paced back and forth, his boots crunching against the dirt. "This is insane. I just met you. You just met me. And now you're... what? Trying to... He trailed off, not even sure how to finish that sentence. Sia's gaze never left him. She wasn't upset. She wasn't hurt. She was simply waiting. Patient. Silent. Like she already knew what his answer would be. Mark stopped walking and looked at her. His pulse was still racing. He wasn't sure what to do, what to say. But deep down, he knew the truth. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. Not even close. The escape plan. Mark's mind raced as he paced back and forth. The cold wind brushed against his face, but he barely noticed. Sia sat by the fire, watching him with calm, patient eyes. She had chosen him. She had touched his heart. And she had made the gesture, the one that meant something more. Mark stopped pacing, inhaled sharply, and rubbed his face. "Saya, I don't think you understand," he muttered, more to himself than her. "I'm not from here. I have a ship. I have a life somewhere else." Saya didn't move. He sighed. "I have to leave." At that she reacted. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Then she stood up. Mark instinctively took a step back. There was something different in her posture now. Tense. Guarded. "I can't stay," he continued, trying to keep his voice steady. "And you need to be safe." Saya tilted her head. "Safe?" Mark blinked. Did she just understand that? Saya took a step forward, raising a hand toward his chest. Mark caught her wrist gently, stopping her. "Sia, please," he said. Her golden eyes flickered with something dangerous. Not anger, not violence, but something raw, something ancient. She pulled her wrist away from his grasp. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away from the fire. Mark hesitated for a moment before following. "Suya," he called. She didn't stop. She led him toward a narrow canyon, deeper into the rocky terrain. Mark kept close, his instincts on high alert. He didn't know why, but he felt like something big was about to happen. After a few minutes, they reached a massive stone structure, half buried in the ground. It was old, ancient, even. Vines and cracks covered its surface. Symbols, similar to the ones Sia had drawn before, were carved into the stone. Mark's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a ruin. This was her home. Or at least, what was left of it. Sia stopped in front of a large, jagged crack in the wall. She placed a hand on the stone and whispered something in her strange, melodic language. Then she stepped aside and gestured for Mark to enter. Mark hesitated. The air inside was thick, charged with something ancient, something powerful. But he stepped inside anyway. Inside the ruins. The inside of the structure was dark, cold, but the moment Mark entered, strange blue glyphs flickered to life along the walls, pulsing with soft light. Saya moved ahead with ease, navigating the space like she had walked these halls 1,000 times before. Mark's boots echoed against the stone floor as he followed. "Saya, what is this place?" She didn't answer. Instead, she led him to the center of the chamber. There, sitting atop a raised platform, was an artifact. A glowing, crystal-like structure, pulsing with energy. Mark instinctively reached for his scanner, but Sia grabbed his wrist before he could use it. She shook her head. "No, not yet." Mark swallowed. "Okay, then what is it?" Saya slowly walked toward the artifact and placed both hands on it. The glow pulsed in response, and suddenly, the room came alive. The glyphs along the walls shifted, rearranging into something new. Then holographic images flickered to life around them. Mark's eyes widened. What the hell? The images showed a city, her city, before it was destroyed. Massive structures reaching toward the sky, floating platforms, glowing energy sources. Then he saw them. Her people. Tall, graceful beings with golden eyes, just like Sia. They moved in harmony, their voices blending into soft, melodic sounds. But then, the destruction. The sky darkened. Ships, massive and terrifying, descended like shadows of death. Fire rained from above. Buildings crumbled. Screams filled the air. Mark clenched his jaw. A war. Saya nodded. Then the holograms showed her, a younger version of Saya, running, hiding, watching as everything she knew burned. Mark felt a lump in his throat. She had survived. Alone. For years. The holograms flickered and disappeared. The room fell silent again, except for the soft hum of the artifact. Saya turned to Mark, stepping closer. She pointed to the holograms. Then she pointed at herself. Then she pointed at him. Mark exhaled. "You think I'm supposed to... what? Help you?" Saya didn't move. Mark shook his head. "Saya, I'm just a guy. I'm not some chosen hero." Saya raised a single eyebrow. Mark sighed. "You're not gonna let this go, are you?" She slowly, deliberately, shook her head. Mark rubbed his temples. What the hell was he supposed to do? He had planned to leave the planet, to go back to his ship, back to his life. But now, everything had changed. Saya had chosen him, not just as her protector, not just as her companion, but as her future. Mark inhaled sharply. "All right, let's get one thing straight." Saya's eyes locked onto his. "If I take you with me," he said, voice firm, "you have to understand something." He stepped closer, holding her gaze. "I'm not a god. I'm not a warrior. I don't have a magic plan to save your people." Saya nodded, waiting. "But," he exhaled, "I won't leave you behind." Saya's eyes softened. Then she smiled. A real, genuine smile. And Mark knew, right then and there was no turning back now. The ultimate test. The sky had darkened even further, and the wind howled like a predator hunting its prey. Mark stood in the center of the ancient ruins, surrounded by the eerie glow of the artifact, feeling the weight of everything he had learned in the last few hours pressing down on him. He could no longer deny the truth. His life, the path he had been on, had changed in ways he could not have imagined. Saya stood a few feet away, her expression calm but intense, her golden eyes gleaming in the dim light. She was ready, waiting, as if she knew the next step already, as if she had always known. Mark ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "All right, let's go," he muttered, his voice tight. "No more delays. We have a ship to catch." Saya didn't respond. She simply gave him a nod, her body already moving toward the opening in the stone structure. She was leading him again, guiding him with purpose. Mark followed her, his mind racing with the thoughts of what lay ahead. There was no going back now. The path was set. He couldn't leave her behind. Not after everything. Not after the way she had saved him and fought for him. But was he really the person she needed? He wasn't a warrior, a leader, or anything close to the hero she might think him to be. The journey to the ship. They walked for hours. The terrain was harsh, and the planet's atmosphere made it difficult to breathe comfortably. But Sia never slowed. Her pace was steady and relentless, almost as if she were on a mission that had been waiting for her to complete. Mark, on the other hand, found himself struggling to keep up. The weight of everything, the danger, the unknown, pressed heavily on his chest. He glanced over at Sia. Her face was set in a mask of determination. She had been through so much, survived so long, and yet she seemed as focused and calm as ever. It wasn't until the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon that Mark began to see the first signs of what lay ahead. The ship. There it was, his ship, the Endeavor, perched on the edge of a rocky cliff. It was battered from its journey, but it was still functional. He had set the coordinates earlier, but now, with Sia by his side, it felt different. It felt like the ship was the last place of safety, the last chance at escaping the chaos this planet had offered. But as they approached, something felt wrong. The air shifted, grew thicker. The temperature dropped. The tremors Mark had ignored earlier started again, this time stronger. What the hell is going on? Mark muttered to himself. Sia stopped walking. Her head snapped toward the ship, her eyes scanning the landscape, her body tense. There was a flash of recognition in her eyes. She took a slow step forward, her senses on high alert. Then it hit. The ground beneath their feet rumbled. Mark barely had time to react before he saw it. A shadow sweeping across the ground, growing larger by the second. Something huge was coming. Before he could even process what was happening, Sia pushed him forward. "Run," she shouted. Mark's legs moved instinctively, adrenaline flooding his system. The rumbling grew louder. He dared to look over his shoulder, just in time to see a massive, creature-like figure rising from the depths of the valley, towering above the landscape. It was a beast, an enormous shadowy leviathan, with scales as dark as the night, eyes glowing with an eerie predatory light. "God, what is that?" Mark shouted, trying to keep up with Sia. "It's coming for us," she yelled back, her voice laced with urgency. Mark's heart raced. This was no ordinary predator. This was something else, something far more terrifying. The creature bellowed, a deafening sound that echoed through the valley, its enormous body crushing rocks underfoot. It was fast, despite its size. Mark could hear its claws scraping against the ground, feeling the vibrations in his bones as it charged toward them. Sia moved like lightning, her reflexes beyond anything Mark had ever seen. She grabbed Mark's hand and yanked him toward the ship, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. But the creature wasn't far behind. It was gaining on them. Faster. Mark gasped, his lungs burning with each step. He could see the Endeavor now, so close, but the massive beast was almost upon them. Its growl vibrated through the air like an earthquake. Sia didn't stop. She didn't even look back. She pulled him forward, leaping over rocks, weaving between boulders, each step more urgent than the last. Mark glanced over his shoulder again. The creature was too close, too fast. Sia reached the ship first, her hands flying over the controls with a precision that startled Mark. She was already in the cockpit, and within moments, the ship's engines roared to life. The Endeavor slowly lifted off the ground. But it wasn't fast enough. The creature lunged. Mark reached the entrance, his hand slamming into the door controls just as the beast's claws scraped across the ship's hull, leaving deep, jagged scratches in the metal. He barely made it inside. The door slammed shut behind him, just as the creature slammed into the ship, rattling the entire structure. Mark stumbled back into the cockpit, his heart racing, gasping for breath. Saya didn't say a word. She was already adjusting the ship's altitude, her fingers flying across the control panel. Mark's mind was spinning, trying to piece together what had just happened. The ground trembled beneath them, but the ship was slowly gaining altitude. He could feel the beast's growls echoing even from inside the ship. It was only when the ship reached a safe height, hovering just above the planet's atmosphere, that Mark dared to speak. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. Saya didn't answer at first. She simply stared at the view ahead, her expression unreadable. Then her golden eyes flicked to Mark, and she spoke softly, almost like a warning. "Not all creatures on this planet are as they seem." Mark swallowed hard. He didn't know what that meant. He didn't know what anything meant anymore. The new beginning. The ship hummed steadily as it drifted farther from the planet's surface. Mark gazed out the cockpit window, watching the once violent world shrink into a speck of red and brown beneath them. The planet that had become both a prison and a battleground for Sia's survival now felt distant, like a memory already fading. But it wasn't truly gone for either of them. Mark could feel it in the pit of his stomach. This world, these experiences, had marked them both. Saya sat silently beside him, her golden eyes fixed on the void of space ahead. She hadn't spoken since the ship had finally cleared the planet's atmosphere. Her face was unreadable, but there was a sense of relief in the way she held herself now. She was no longer bound by that planet. But Mark could tell, with her quiet intensity, that the weight of everything she had lost, the people, the culture, the life, was still weighing heavily on her. Mark glanced at her, trying to gauge her thoughts. "You okay?" he asked softly. It was a stupid question. Of course, she wasn't okay. How could she be? Saya turned her head slowly to meet his gaze, her expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something soft, something vulnerable. It was the first time Mark had seen her like this since he had found her starving on that planet. She wasn't the fierce, indestructible fighter anymore. She wasn't the silent, mysterious alien who had saved his life. She was just Sia, alone in the vastness of space, just like he was. Mark exhaled, his fingers lightly tapping against the ship's control panel. "We're not out of danger yet," he said quietly. "There's still a lot we need to figure out." Saya nodded, then reached for his hand. The gesture was simple, but it carried an undeniable weight. She was trying to communicate without words again, trying to connect, to show him something. Mark could feel the warmth of her hand in his, the faint tremor of her fingers as she held on. "Together," she whispered, her voice soft, yet filled with a kind of resolve. The word was strange coming from her, foreign in its sound. But it held power, a promise. Mark swallowed hard. "Together," he repeated, his voice barely audible. He had come here for answers, for the safety of returning home. But now, he felt a deep, unexpected connection to this girl. This warrior who had nothing left but the promise of survival. The silence stretched between them for a moment, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was like the silence of understanding, of shared loss and shared survival. There was a bond between them now that went beyond words, beyond actions. It was something deeper, something neither of them had expected. The vast unknown. Sia turned her attention back to the star-filled void, the glow of distant galaxies casting a soft light on her face. She wasn't just looking at the stars. She was thinking. Mark could see it in the way her eyes narrowed slightly, the way her fingers flexed at her sides. She had no home anymore. No people. No purpose other than survival. Mark didn't know how to fix that. How could anyone fix something that deep? But as he looked at her, the weight of everything they had just endured, fighting for their lives, escaping the planet, the beast that nearly tore them apart, it felt like the start of something bigger. They had survived together. And for Sia, that might be enough. For now. "Where do we go from here?" Mark asked, his voice a little shakier than he wanted it to be. He was asking her, but he wasn't sure if he was ready for the answer. Syed didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned back to face him, her expression unreadable but somehow calm. Then, without warning, she reached over and began to adjust the ship's navigation system. Mark's eyebrows shot up in surprise as the ship's course shifted. "Where are we going?" Mark asked, voice thick with confusion. Syed didn't respond with words. She only glanced up at him for a brief moment before returning her gaze to the controls. Then she pressed a button. A holographic map of the galaxy appeared, and her fingers began tracing a path across the stars. Mark stared at the map. That's beyond any known colonies. That's near the outer rim of the galaxy. He paused, blinking. That's a place no one goes. That's dangerous. It's unexplored. Saya looked at him again, this time her eyes soft but filled with something else. "Hope. New home," she whispered. The words were quiet but meaningful, like a piece of a puzzle finally clicking into place. Mark stared at her, disbelief and awe mixing inside him. She was serious. She wasn't looking for a place to hide. She wasn't looking for a safe haven. She was looking for a new beginning. A place where she could rebuild. A place where she could finally have purpose again. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low. "This isn't just about running away, is it?" Saya shook her head, her expression unwavering. She wasn't running from anything. She was running towards something. Mark felt a rush of emotions, but above all, he felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about him anymore. This wasn't about getting back to his life. This was about her, about giving her the chance to rebuild, to find peace, to start anew. "Okay," Mark said, his voice thick with a newfound resolve. "We'll go there. Together." Saya's golden eyes softened. She reached for his hand again, her fingers curling around his with gentle precision. They had no map for this journey, no clear answers, no guarantee of safety or success. They were both lost in their own ways. But they had each other. And that, Mark realized, was enough to start over. The infinite horizon. As the ship soared deeper into the galaxy, the stars stretched out before them, infinite and unknown. There were no guarantees, no promises, but they had each other. And that was enough. Mark sat back in his seat, letting the hum of the engines become the backdrop to his thoughts. He couldn't predict what the future held. He didn't know if they would find what they were searching for. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that maybe he wasn't as lost as he had thought. That maybe together, they could find something new, something worth fighting for. Saya stood by the viewport, watching the stars drift by, her posture calm but certain. And Mark realized, in that quiet moment, that they weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. And the journey was just beginning.